Hey guys, it's Jessica Ward King, the StigmaCrusher here. Back to my channel. Sorry I wasn't here this past week. I had camera trouble last week and then I got sick, so I couldn't film at the beginning of this week, and it was a whole thing. So here we are. You got me this week. And this week I wanted to talk about cultural stigma. So, what is cultural stigma? It is the cultural soup that we all live in, the one that we grew up with, learning about since we were knee high to a grasshopper, about what mental illness is, what it means to have mental illness. And well, kind of going back to what stigma is, stigma came from the Greeks. They used to take a stick and literally poke people with a stick, the people that they thought were undesirable. So like the prostitutes, the thieves, the unclean, the basically the undesirables of society. They would poke them with a stick and brand them, and that mark, that stigma, would tell other people that those people were the undesirables of the society. So it would literally give them a brand, a mark, so that other people would know not to associate with those people. And that is the stigma that we come to know today. And now today we are much more subversive about it. We don't literally poke people with a stick. Today we are much more subversive, and instead we link people with an undesirable attribute. So in this case, mental illness. We link them with that undesirable attribute through kind of a more underground process. And so some folks have, as I mentioned last time, you're able to tell that they have this undesirable trait because they are discredited. So you can tell that they have it because, for example, someone with psychosis may have a particular way of talking that you can tell that, hey, they quote unquote talk funny, and so maybe that they have mental illness because they talk in a certain way. And so that person you may be able to tell, whereas other people you can't immediately tell, and so you would have to quote unquote poke them with a stick in order to be able to tell. But so they would be called discreditable, but you might be able to tell in other ways, like for example, if you saw them go to a psychiatrist's office, or if you saw them take medication, or if they told you. So for example, I might have a discreditable illness, but if I tell you that I have bipolar disorder, now you know. And so you would be able to link me with that stigma about mental illness because I've told you. Either way, we often just assume that people have mental illness because of things that we infer about their personality or infer about their behavior, and that we'll get to in a moment. But cultural stigma is this kind of collective wisdom, if you will, or collective smarts that we have about mental illness. It is the thing that tells us that we should clutch our child's hand tightly and rush to the other side of the street if we see someone sitting on a street corner, slightly unkempt, talking to themselves, right? That's because that person is obviously got mental illness, and therefore they are unstable and might be violent, right? Because we all know, because of cultural stigma, we all know that people with mental illness are likely to be unstable and therefore also violent. And that's one of the stereotypes, because we know that stigma is linked with stereotypes, right, about mental illness. One of the stereotypes about mental illness is that people with mental illness are potentially violent. And that's one of the really big problems with cultural stigma and the stigmas around mental illness, is the one about violence. Because as soon as you see something happen in the news, like just this past week, we had the horrible mass shooting in the United States. And as soon as that happened, before the news was even freshly off the page, immediately people were saying, well, that he must have had mental illness. Before anyone knew anything, he must have had mental illness. In order for someone to do something that violent and that abhorrent, they must have had mental illness. Now, it turns out that that individual does have a history of mental illness, and that there was a history of mental illness very recently. And therefore, everyone says, there we go, vindicated. History of mental illness, that's why they were violent. which is the problem, right? We have very high profile cases where there is a history of mental illness and violence, and therefore they're inextricably linked. People with mental illness are violent, which is, of course, not the case. We actually know that people with mental illness are much more likely to be victims of violence than they are to be perpetrators. It's just that there are very high profile cases like this one that get splashed across the front pages of the newspaper, and they get burned into people's minds and into the cultural stigma. And people, it gets like burned right into people's collective wisdom that therefore people with mental illness are violent. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a case where a pilot crashed their plane right into the side of the Swiss Alps. And immediately after that, everyone cried out that this person must have had mental illness because they killed not only everyone in the plane, but also themselves. And in order to do something that abhorrent and suicidal, you must have had mental illness. Well, it turns out that there was no history of mental illness. That person had never been to a psychiatrist or even a therapist. The friends and family didn't see it coming. There was no indication that there was any mental illness or even mental health issues in that person's history. There was absolutely no history of mental illness whatsoever. And yet still a lot of people called for saying, well, there must have been a history of mental illness, because in order for the person to do something that abhorrent and that violent and suicidal, they must have been mentally ill. It's simply not possible for those two things to have happened and not, for the person not to have been mentally ill. And they simply would not believe that there was not a history of mental illness there. Because of the cultural stigma. You have to have been mentally ill in order to be violent in this manner. And it's a very, very damaging stigma for there to be, because people with mental illness are feared because of it. Because even though I might myself right now may not be violent, you never know when I could be. You never know when I could snap, you see, and become violent at any time. And so as a result, should I be trusted with children? Should I be trusted with the care of older adults? Should I be trusted with the care of anyone, really, for that matter? Should I be trusted even with the care of myself, if I could at any moment snap, right? And so, and the fear is real. And not only the fear of other people, but even self-stigma, the fear from my own self that, could I potentially be violent? Should I even trust myself with the care of children, with the care of older adults, with the care of myself? And so this fear, because of the stigma, is real, and it's very, very damaging. And so that is something that in cultural stigma that is extremely problematic for the mental health community. And it's not only the fear of violence that is damaging, it's also the stigma around, and it kind of goes with this, but I mean, you will have seen it in the past week with Halloween. This cultural stigma around restraint and psychiatric hospitals, and basically the image of the psycho killer and the deranged mental patient and all of those kind of costumes that you will have seen at Halloween time. It is cultural stigma that tells us that those things are appropriate, that those things are scary, that those things are good for shock value, and that it's appropriate to fetishize those things for the use for a Halloween costume. And the use of restraints is particularly bothersome because for people with mental illness who have been in hospital and have been subject to use of restraints in hospital, that can be a very, very scary and very difficult time in their lives and a very difficult experience. And to see that used as a costume is, it can be a very difficult experience to see that used as a costume. It can be re-traumatizing for that person. And so, and it's cultural stigma that tells us that, that's an okay costume, that's something that we can use in horror films, that's something that we can use as a horror prop for Halloween use. These are all kind of part and parcel of cultural stigma of this collective wisdom about what we know to be true about mental illness and what we know to be appropriate to say and think and do around mental illness. And so what I want to move to next is, what do we do about this, right? So we know that it's a problem to talk about mental illness and to act around mental illness as though it's dangerous, as though it's problematic. Because, I mean, if you're here, I'm preaching to the converted, right? If you're here watching this video, chances are good that you're a stigma crusher at heart, and that you're already thinking to yourself that it's not appropriate to be preaching that people with mental illness are violent and so on, and that it's probably not appropriate to be wearing the costumes and so on and so forth. But what do we do about it if we see other people doing these things? And more importantly, what do we do about the crossing the street? What do we do about safety issues? What do we do about that? Because it's inherent, because we've grown up with it, right? Because it's our collective wisdom, because we've grown up with these impulses to cross to the other side of the street when we see someone mumbling on our side of the street, mumbling to themselves on the side. It's that collective wisdom, but it's also an impulse because we've grown up with it. We've been told it's a safety risk, especially if you are like myself, like a single woman or person out with their child. You've been told it's a safety risk. You grow up believing that it is. And yet now I'm telling you, it's not a safety risk. It's a stigma. That's not a risk of violence. Chances are that person is just a person. Perhaps they are struggling with their mental health, and perhaps they are talking to themselves. But if you said hello to them, they would probably say hello back. Perhaps they wouldn't, just like anyone else on the street, right? Just like that old lady on the street, or just like that teenager on the street, they may or may not say hello back. But the chances of them being unstably violent towards you are extremely low, just as low as anyone else on the street, chances are. And so if I'm telling you that, then what should the behavior be? My argument, and my argument to myself as well, because I'm subject to that same cultural stigma and that same impulse to cross to the other side. But what I tell myself is, no, stay on this side of the street. It's not a safety issue. It's a stigma issue. And I'm going to crush the stigma today. And I'm going to show everyone else on the street that I'm going to crush this stigma. And I'm going to say hello to this person. And maybe they're going to say hello back or not. Whatever. That's fine. But it's just any other person on the street. And I'm going to crush this stigma. And I'm going to show everyone else that I'm going to crush this stigma. And it's going to take some courage to do, because it's not the automatic behavior. It's not the behavior that you've grown up being taught to do. It's not the behavior that you've grown up automatically doing. It takes courage to do, and it takes thinking about it. It takes actually going against the grain. But it's worthwhile doing, because cultural stigma is everywhere. And if we don't crush that stigma consciously, day in, day out, we are going to end up with another generation of young people that have the same unconscious stigma that we do, and that are going to have to go through the same type of conscious decision to either go against that stigma or perpetuate it like we are now. And so it takes being conscious about it and being intentional about it and crushing that stigma day in, day out. It also takes having those difficult conversations. So when we are talking about the news with people and they're saying, that person must have mental illness, or more likely they're saying that person must be crazy in order to do that. First of all, correcting the language, which is difficult enough in and of itself, saying, we don't say crazy, could we please say that person must have mental illness? And then secondly, correcting the actual thought behind it and saying, people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than they are to be perpetrators. It's just these high-profile cases in the media that make you believe that everyone with mental illness is violent and vice versa, but it's not actually the case. or when it's the case of the Halloween costume, which hopefully you won't have to deal with for another year now. But when it's the case of the Halloween costume, engaging in discussion and saying something like, you know, that Halloween costume is probably really harmful to somebody that's actually had the experience of being in restraints in a psychiatric hospital. It's probably really re-traumatizing. What do you think you're going to be next year that could be different? And having that conversation. Again, it's not a comfortable conversation to have. Somebody that thinks that their costume's pretty rad and pretty, you know, spooky or provocative or whatever, doesn't probably want to have that conversation with you. But it's worthwhile just planting the seed in their minds that maybe it wasn't the most appropriate costume. They may not have thought of that. They may not have thought that there was anything wrong with their costume, and maybe just planting the seed will help them to think that maybe next year repurposing their costume and, you know, being it again is maybe not the best idea. So maybe they'll relegate that costume to the bottom of the tickle trunk. So that's what I wanted to reflect on this week, is how we can crush that cultural stigma. It's uncomfortable, as I say. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy or comfortable. And I have to consciously make myself do it all the time. Sometimes I fail. And just if you find yourself that, you know, you passed up an opportunity to do it, be gracious with yourself. It's going to come up all the time because unfortunately, these issues with cultural stigma, they do come up all the time. We have issues in the news constantly about violence and people talking about mental illness in relation to violence all the time. So if you pass up an opportunity once, don't worry, you'll get another opportunity probably sooner than you would like to. So be gracious with yourself. You will have lots of opportunities to do this and practice often. And take care of yourself this week. Next week, we're going to talk a bit about institutional stigma, which is the stigmas. It's just like cultural stigma, except for it happens in our institutions, like healthcare institutions or educational institutions, or even in our beloved sports institutions. So we're going to talk a bit about that next week, so stay tuned for that. And that will mark the end of our stigma series. And so if you have any other ideas about videos that you'd like to see me do, please do comment down below. Take care of yourselves this week, and I will see you in my next one. Bye, guys.
Stigma Crusher.